Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming to Your Passport Doesn't Work Here, Asylum, Space, and Iranian Queer Heritage with Denise Moyeri. A couple housekeeping items before we start. Everybody can mute themselves during the presentation period, and feel free to keep your cameras on so Paniz can see you while she's presenting.
Yes, please, if you can, it would be great.
We are also currently recording this event, so if you do not want to be seen in the recording or you don't want your name shown, now you can turn your camera off and change your display name. And if anybody has any accessibility concerns that were not identified on their registration form, please send a private message to Waterloo Architecture in the chat so that we can accommodate you.
And for the land acknowledgement, although we are not physically there, we acknowledge that the University of Waterloo School of Architecture is located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee peoples. The building is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. We also acknowledge that settler colonialism in the lands we know as Canada is ongoing, and as this is a virtual event, we'd love if everyone willing would tell their land story in the chat box by typing your name, location, and identifying whose traditional territory you're calling from. And if you're not sure, feel free to do this at the link I'm dropping in the chat. And I can start. I'm Simone Delaney, one of your co-moderators tonight. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student at Waterloo Architecture and the current coordinator of Treaty Lands Global Stories. I am bi and use she, they pronouns, and I'm a Black loyalist from New Brunswick, which is part of the Peace and Friendship Treaty Lands of the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy.
Hi, I'm Beth, a third-year student at the School of Architecture. I'll be co-moderating the discussion with Simone tonight. I'm queer, non-binary, and use the pronouns they, them. I'm from and currently reside in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is located in traditional Anishinaabe, Mississauga, Neutral, and Haudenosaunee territory. And tonight we welcome Denise Moyeri, who is an intern architect with the OAA and a 2019 graduate of the MArch program from the University of Waterloo, where she also received her Bachelor of Architectural Studies in 2015. She's a co-founder of Treaty Lands Global Stories and a member of Waterloo Architecture's Racial Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and has been advocating for the acknowledgement of Canada's Indigenous heritage and the decentering of the Western world in architectural education since 2016. Through her graduate studies on Iranian queer heritage, she has won several awards, including the RAIC Honor Roll, the Architectural Research Center Consortium's King Student Medal, and the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies Graduate Prize.
In this talk, Paniz will be exploring the concept of Iranian queer heritage through case studies of spaces that have shaped the experiences of Iranian LGBTQIA+ refugees to Toronto in Iran, Turkey, and Canada. In addition to this presentation of her graduate research, she will speak to her approach towards this personal topic and discuss thoughts on future research about queer space. Paniz is a sexually fluid cisgender woman and was 15 when her family immigrated to Toronto from Tehran. And so welcome, Paniz. We're excited for your presentation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's good to see all the friends and all the people I don't know. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. It means a lot that I've been asked to do this. It's my absolute pleasure. Waterloo Architecture feels like a true home to me. So it means a lot to be asked to be here. And I especially want to thank Anne, because she was my supervisor. And none of the stuff I'm about to talk about would have happened if it wasn't for her persistent, work and just keeping me on track, and her good sense of humor and just dealing with me. So let me share my screen. Can you see it? Are we good? Okay. So before I start, I just want to say that a large portion of my talk today will be about people in displacement. And with this in mind, it would be ignorant for me to not mention that I'm coming to you from what we now call Richmond Hill on the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. And this place is a meeting place of two treaties. It's the lands of the Mississaugas of Credit and the First Nations of the Williams Treaty. I'm not always sure how to reconcile my position as an immigrant to this country that we now call Canada. This country has housed people like me and people I'm going to be speaking about in our exiles, and yet it is rooted in the genocide and white supremacy and the ongoing exile of its own people. I frequently wonder about our roles as settlers who left trauma behind to become unknowing signatories to the treaties of these lands. And I realize that my being here comes with a set of responsibilities that I increasingly am trying to live up to. So today, let's see. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So Beth and Simone kind of covered it. I'm going to be, in great part, I'm going to be talking about my graduate research. But as I do that, I kind of want to keep the ideas around methodology alive as I go around, and the why and how of approaching this research. It's not going to be super explicit, but I'm going to try to drop some tidbits. And if you have any questions, especially the graduate students, feel free to ask it later. And I want to kind of end the talk with some ideas of how this kind of work can be applied to practice. Whether it can be applied to practice, frankly, because yeah, my work was very theoretical and I didn't design anything in the end. So the question of what now is something that I carry with me perpetually. And it's, I worked on this thesis. I started in fall of 2016 and I finished January 2019. So it's been a minute. And since then, I've had kind of time to sit with these questions and have my thoughts simmer a little. And so I'm gonna give you some examples in the end of some more recent stuff to talk about. All right, this thesis is about, my thesis on this one, is about a not so small group of Iranians who have left Iran and continue to leave Iran to seek asylum because they're discriminated against at different capacities as a result of their sexual orientation and or gender identity within the Islamic Republic. The questions that I will be asking and attempting to answer in this presentation are not ones that I started posing when I started this kind of research in 2016. And frankly, many of them have been with me since childhood. I carried them with me to Canada in 2007, which was the very same year that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the then president of the Islamic Republic, claimed that there were no homosexuals in Iran. I have carried these thoughts with me as I question my own sexuality and where I fit into the larger narrative. And once I was in Canada, I slowly and unfortunately not formally learned and continue to learn about different aspects of Western history of gay and queer rights movements. And when I started my thesis, I wasn't quite sure how any of these ideas would fit into the capital A architecture, and Anne can attest to this. And so, I found myself continue going back to the question of legacy and heritage in the value of queer spaces. And I think that's kind of became the backbone to this work. So that's where I'm going to start talking to you about. The OED defines heritage as that which has been or may be inherited, implying a linear succession through generations. When you're talking about a lot of historically marginalized factors in society like race, religion, all of that, a parent can usually teach their child to a large extent how to deal with the cards that they were dealt with because they themselves experienced it. But gender identity and sexual orientation are not always passed down to children from their parents. And what constitutes, so that kind of raises the question of what constitutes as heritage in the LGBTQ plus community, where marginalization has been the main defining experience and culture for many centuries. So through examining queer history and civil progress, it's undeniable that as long as queer individuals have been ostracized in society, sites found around their isolated social existences have acted as classrooms where lessons on survival, struggle, and resilience have been passed down through generations. In the West, early cruising grounds, hidden bars, and bathhouses acted as kind of hidden layers to cities and allowed for freedoms of expression at a time where no other venues were accepting of queer identity. And many scholars have drawn parallels between these spaces and that of the queer closet, which is the metaphorical origin of queer identity and oppression. It can be argued that these initial locations for queer gatherings created places for nurture, but also for segregation, where a closeting that can be detrimental to the progression desired by contemporary rights movements. In other words, these spaces have acted like Foucauldian heterotopias, to drop a big word on you. At once, they're apart from, and yet they mirror the realities of the societies that they belong to, where culture is represented, opposed, and reversed. in spaces that are not freely accessible. The question of heritage in queer spaces is similarly paradoxical. It's at once taking us back to the segregated closet, and yet it acts as a home to queer culture that is born around oppression and resilience. To kind of take it back a notch and talk about queer as a concept, I should point out that despite how we tend to use queer these days as an umbrella term, queer theory actually has its roots in a post-structuralist desire to be critical of stabilized sexual identities. It is a term that is meant to be radically inclusive to eradicate all labels. And with this in mind, defining queer heritage brings up two main challenges. One, it homogenizes the members of the queer community under one heritage, which kind of can't be done. And two, it glamorizes the closet. So first, as attested by the growing number of letters on the list of LGBTQ2AI+, queer heritage cannot be homogeneous. You're talking about different people with entirely different experiences. Queer theorists like Eve Kozovsky-Sedgwick argue that we can never be sure to what extent we can take a liberty in grouping individuals based merely on the nature of their marginalization due to sexual orientation or gender identity, which are factors that are affected by other markers like race, class, education, etc. And as such, we can't paint everyone with the same heritage, whether they're queer or not. And let's say there was one collective and inclusive queer heritage. If it did, it would inherently be paradoxical, especially when we think about its relationship to a space. Sedgwick argues that gay existence has been defined by its relationship to the private, closeted life. While this has given gay culture and identity a level of consistency, one must remember that by focusing too much on this continuity and centrality of the closet over history, we forget the problems with the closet to begin with, and we start to glamorize it. So we actually need to be utopian about the desire and action to get rid of the closet altogether. But regardless of how you look at it, one thing that keeps popping up is that queer spaces, whether they're good or bad representations of the closet, they're produced by queer presence through occupation, play, performance, and ultimately in places like gay villages through the economy that gets formed around these persistent existences, this queering of space, as a lot of scholars refer to. So culturally in the West, many of these queer spaces have acted as sites of resistance, especially when their relative sanctuary has been violated. And sometimes these acts of outrage have resulted in big jumps forward, like in San Francisco at Compton's Cafeteria in '66, which was the first ever recorded civil uprising of the LGBTQ community. Or in New York at Stonewall in '69, which are the riots that are often seen as the birthplace of modern North American gay rights movements. And on the streets of Toronto after the bathhouse raids in '81, which is often dubbed as Canada's Stonewall. So if there is a queer cultural heritage to speak of, its preservation is undoubtedly tied to the persistent claiming of queer space, the queering of space. The built form of today's queer spaces, as such, are not just shelters for protection and passing on of queer heritage in secret. The sanctity of these spaces have continually shaped this heritage and have inherently defined the growth of their communities. To continue a legacy of progression, we must then continue to have safe queer spaces while addressing their previous shortcomings. All right, so with that in mind, let's bring the question to what happens to a queer community if it's displaced? There's no spaces. Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the implementation of the Islamic Penal Code in Iran, the predicament of the Iranian members of the LGBTQ community has reached a new critical point. With no legal protection and active criminalization of the group, social, economic, and cultural oppression towards the queer community has further perpetuated other injustices, resulting in an increasing number of Iranian queers who have joined the already significant exodus out of Iran by seeking asylum. Before 2018, when many refugee laws changed, and this is when I was writing my thesis, many did so by filing claims through the UNHCR in transit countries like Turkey, and then were resettled in Western countries like Canada and the United States. Iranian queer culture and heritage are now rooted in displacement, in exile. A lot of queer organizations that are Iranian are in exile. What comes of queer individuals with no consistency of presence in any space? So to tackle these questions, I wanted to speak to individuals who had been through this process, seeking asylum with the UNHCR, and then had been settled in Toronto. And with the help of the Iranian Queer Organization in Toronto, I met many people, actually, three of whom, Elina, Humana, and Pedram, whose photos you see, were very kind and generous enough to let me bug them for 2 years as I asked them many, many questions and got to know them. And in the end, from what they taught me, from what I learned through theory, history, archival research, drawings, site visits, and as much exposure as I could possibly get, this thesis was born as an iterative process, looking at different information through different lenses. The work is organized into 3 parts, which replicates the movement of the refugees that I will be speaking about. From Tehran to Turkey to Toronto, spatial case studies helped me understand how productions of space contributed to the making, or maybe they didn't contribute to the making, of Iranian queer heritage. So starting with Tehran, my hometown. All right, in a country like Iran, where many everyday activities like drinking, dancing, hanging out with members of the opposite sex are considered illegal, or at the very least heavily regulated, queer spaces fall under a larger category of countercultural spaces. To get around many of the restrictions, Iranians have devised different spatial practices to cope. And this is general society here. First, in lieu of spaces like bars and clubs, private spaces are often transformed to create public spaces of gathering. Second, many public spaces are used through planning to extend the freedoms of the private realm. So here you see a photo from Jam food court in Tehran, where every Tuesday night, gay men gather for dinner. The public space transforms into a private space for the queer community, for the specifically male gay community, since many in the city know of this ritual. Another instance of this privatization of space is door-door, which is basically using private spaces on wheels, cars, allowing for individuals to create deliberate traffic jams or continually loop around the street to flirt with members of the opposite sex. This is predominantly practiced for straight couples, but as we'll see, it will inform the way male cruising also works in Tehran. Finally, both sets of private and public spaces are activated through channels of communication on social media. Cyberspace has created its own venues to compensate for many shortcomings, and as it does everywhere else. So in all of the above examples of countercultural spaces, whether they're queer or not, public space is not truly used as a democratizing space with equal access to all, which is what, as Western educated architects, we would like to think public space is. Even when public spaces are activated, their users remain grouped by their specific socioeconomic backgrounds and interests that brought them to these places in the first place. Mobilization through certain creations of public queer space was what I was intrigued. What intrigued me when I was looking at Western examples. So I went looking for these kinds of spaces in Tehran. And cruising grounds for men who seek men, spaces in which strangers seek other strangers for sexual relationships, are the only examples of queer space that I was able to identify in Tehran that distinguish themselves in their public nature. Tehran's practice of cruising demonstrates many patterns seen in the Western cruising grounds for gay men. They are traditional cruising spots. They're parks, areas allowing for pedestrian interaction. But there are also arterial roads allowing for quick and easy car access in and out, modeled similar to the practice of door-door or tolzani, which admittedly is a millennial / Gen Xer term, because those are the people I interviewed. Zoomers might have other terms for it. They might just stick to Instagram as far as I know. But anyways, otolzeni involves individuals driving in loops looking for partners, using flashing low beam lights to garner attention from pedestrian cruisers. In a way, Tehranis have created a made-in-Tehran solution to male cruising that satisfies the needs of cruising while remaining functional under Iran's broader political, legal, and social restrictions. As I examined Tehran's main cruising spots, it became clear that Tehran's cruising spaces differentiate themselves from the city's other spaces of counterculture in 4 main ways, which makes them function as equitable public spaces. First, they inherently operate on a different scale of illegality and public disapproval. This fact automatically politicizes cruising by the small minority who practice it, and cruising becomes a commentary both on the legal and social norms of society. Second, the city's cruising spaces are all located in central Tehran, in the city's most cosmopolitan neighborhood. This area has historically housed religious and ethnic minorities, foreign embassies, universities, cultural establishments, you name it. The location makes the area accessible to those in diverse socioeconomic classes from different neighborhoods, while the variety of programs that exist in the area become more permitting of LGBTQ+ activity. Third, this central location dictates certain patterns on traffic and the closures of programs in the area. The concentration of educational and institutional programs in the area create a daily rhythm in this neighborhood, which means that the street gets fairly deserted at night when the stores and offices close, and traffic regulations that exist in central Tehran are lifted so people can actually drive into central Tehran. Finally, the built environments of the parks and overpasses in this neighborhood further work in the shadows to foster hidden spaces for cruising. The human scale of the sidewalks and the street furniture facilitate pedestrian cruisers, while the wide infrastructural, I can speak English, everybody, infrastructural streets and the network of roads aid the drivers as they look for partners, allowing for continuous inconspicuous looping of the cars. And you see this with the GIS calculations I did here. It turns out that the optimal speed for the number of loops around Karimkhanezand Avenue, which is one of the main cruising spots in Tehran, compared to how far it takes from a person to go from one end of the street to the other end of the street, that optimal time is at night, exactly coordinating with the program closures on the street. All right, so reflecting on queer heritage in Tehran, I think this heritage is really fleeting. It's in the elongated moments on the sidewalk as pedestrians ask each other for a lighter. It is in the hidden codes as a driver circles around, flashing the low beam light. The Iranian queer heritage showcased here is not definable. It is very fleeting. It is in the ingenuity and the creativity required to not get caught. And I want you to remember this keyword fleeting, which is something a lot of theorists talk about when they talk about queer space. And I want you to hold on to this because at the end, when I'm kind of having some concluding thoughts, we're going to come back to it. Okay. Then we go to Turkey. And we're going to talk about the asylum seekers and refugees there. As you will see on the left, Iran is in a particularly interesting position, both as a very large host and a significant source to displaced people. There are different reasons why Iranians leave Iran to seek asylum, and that's a whole other conversation we can have. But spatially speaking, they're dispersed everywhere you might think of and more. As the map you see on the right indicates. The numbers are from 2016 UNHCR data here. And Turkey is basically, according to the 2016 data, is the #2 host to displaced Iranians. And the reason why Turkey is such a big host to Iranians signifies the main points of the section I'm about to talk to you about. It is in the limbo of displacement, legislation, both internationally, regionally, and the scale of nations, use spatial definitions to control and limit the rights of asylum seekers. Individuals get fully stripped of their rights and liberties with the promise of absolute Western freedoms in the destination country. Four main international legal spatial practices basically result in the restrictions that contribute to Turkey, or used to contribute to Turkey before 2018, as a large host to displaced Iranian, particularly LGBTQ+ Iranians. First, anti-Iranian visa policies restrict legal arrival in Western countries. Then, laws like the Dublin regulation create further hurdles in the process of seeking asylum in Europe. Then, stricter and arguably less fair European refugee determination processes for LGBTQ+ asylum seekers leads people not to want to claim asylum there. And finally, in many European practices exist that if you want to seek asylum in those places, you live in incredibly difficult conditions as an asylum seeker while you're during that process. So these four factors, in addition to dangers that are attributed to illegal crossings, which we're all familiar with, historically made Turkey, Iran's neighbor that has no visa restrictions for Iranians to arrive to, easily accessible as a location for people to seek refuge in. And for LGBTQ plus asylum seekers in particular, prior to September 2018, when the UNHCR in Turkey ceased to accept any new asylum files, the UN's more established and empathetic regulation for LGBTQ plus refugees made Turkey the most viable option for individuals in the region who wanted to seek asylum. And moving away from this global scale to the specific domestic scale in Turkey, we see that through Turkish laws, though Turkish laws do not allow for granting of refugee status for non-Europeans, which is basically all the nationals of the red countries on that map. This is another arbitrary spatial definition that strips the rights of displaced, making this system practically useless for LGBTQ plus people who no longer have the UNHCR to rely on after 2018. The other spatial practice that strips rights in Turkey is their assigned province scheme. Foreigners registered with the Turkish government as asylum seekers are sent to specific cities to stay in while in Turkey. Of Turkey's 81 provinces, these towns, which are yellow on the map, are the most conservative 62. This puts LGBTQ individuals in more danger by placing them in unsafe cities, where in some cases they face danger, more dangerous situations than what they escaped from. An ability to hold even a black market job due to one's queer identity, gay and trans bashings, the cases of sexual harassment and abuse are the frequent consequences of the assigned system. The more marginalized one person is, the bigger the consequences become. Some trans women in particular live in quite dangerous conditions with limited or no access to healthcare, and many engage in sex work to survive. But the other side of Turkey I want to talk to you about is the resistance of the LGBTQ refugees against this system. So Elina, Human, and Pedram that I spoke to you about earlier, each practiced their own individualities by queering the very same spaces that were violating their rights. Here you see a picture from when Pedram was thrown in jail for absolutely no reason in Malaysia. And he used a ketchup packs that he was given with his ramen to eat as meals to paint on the wall. And that was the way he asserted himself in space and kept himself sane. A similar spatial resistance can be found in individuals ignoring the assigned city system by helping each other out in different cities. This is the apartment building where Elina, Human, and Pedram all lived in at one point in Ankara, and it's a perfect example of the home base through which many other Iranian asylum seekers have passed through on their journeys. So the queer heritage of Iranians in the purgatory of Turkey cannot just be summarized in the horrors of this transit country. Turkey is where Iranians can dance in clubs for the very first time. It is where they get their first exposure to a relatively out queer culture, though in recent years it's getting worse and worse. And they go on their first pride parades. Again, recently they've been getting tear gassed, so not so much. Okay. But Turkey is never home to the asylum seekers. The goal is a sensationalized home elsewhere. This wait for permanency is what shapes the experiences of Turkey. Much of the queer heritage Iranian refugees experience in Turkey is hidden inside apartment buildings, erased from view. And for the three individuals I spoke to, their experiences outside of Iran before arriving in Canada really shapes how they see the concept of home and domesticity. For them, home is a portable refuge. It's less about location and more about the feeling of safety and rituals that provide that. It's a lot about chosen families that were formed in Turkey and the activities around that. So I want you to remember this. This is the second. So the first thing I told you to remember was the fleeting concept when it comes to queer heritage. And this is the idea that it's not really actually about the four walls of a space, but it's about rituals, about people you share the spaces with that kind of create and inform those spaces. Finally, we arrive in Toronto. Getting to Toronto might bring certain freedoms for queer refugees, but it also creates new problems. Financial issues, challenges with housing, mental, physical health, and English, which perpetuates all the other problems, are some of the biggest barriers into joining the workforce or the education institutions for Iranian LGBTQ plus arrivals. Struggling with these challenges, the Iranian enclave, which people usually call Tehranto in northern Toronto, and the Church and Wesley Gay Village in downtown have become the two main gateways to the city for queer Iranians. Assuming that in spatial terms, individuals leave Iran to be able to express their personhood in public space, the question becomes whether the two neighborhoods are actually capable of respecting, representing, and catering to this population. So first, looking at Tehranto, this community is a relatively young community, almost exclusively born of the exodus out of Iran following the revolution and the war. The second largest Iranian community after Los Angeles, and it's still fast growing. The enclave stretches along Yonge Street, north of Shepherd Avenue, and it goes all the way up to Newmarket. So you see it in the darker black in this map. Mapping the distribution of different ethnic groups in Toronto will show us that many groups started concentrated eventually grew out of their enclaves. But Iranians, as they will start showing up in the maps I'm going to flip through, are still continuing to congregate. So while other people were congregated and then kind of moved away, Iranians are still kind of piling on top along Yonge Street. So I'm going to go through these maps that I made from census data. So 71, 86, still no Iranians. 99, we start to see some Iranians show up. The revolution was in 79, so people are starting to come. 2001, 2011, which is admittedly not great data because Harper messed up the census that year, and 2016. Okay, so as the map indicates, being an entirely suburban enclave, Tehranto is not comparable to Little Italy's and Little Portugal's when you think of suburban ethnic neighborhoods, or not, rather non-suburban ethnic neighborhoods. You can't get around Tehranto without a car. It is a temple to the car, and the building blocks are strip malls. Combined with the fact that there's almost no cultural representation in the neighborhood beyond commercial activity and the underlying homophobia and transphobia for the new queer arrivals who already have to deal with a lot of traumas from Iran, it's no doubt that many queer Iranians I spoke with didn't frequent the neighborhood that much. Now, there are some who do benefit from the services and job opportunities that are offered here in Farsi, but many do this while closeting themselves. And many have to deal with being treated unfairly as a result. Not just always because they're queer, but in some cases, from what I understand, just like Canadian workplace standards and things like that don't always apply in the neighborhood. At the same time, the more established the Iranian community becomes in Toronto, the larger opportunities become for minority voices within the community. So while none of what I'm about to talk about has any spatial ramifications yet, there are still groups that are starting to assert themselves in Tehranto, like Chelteke, which is a queer and transcultural and educational group that focuses on well-being, or Madaran Rangin Kaman, Mothers of Rainbow, which is kind of an Iranian P flag. Inbuilt Tehranto, more interactions and exposure can result in a slow queering of space in the neighborhood, which can arguably result in some overall inclusive representation in public space. As I discussed earlier, queer space is produced through the occupation of space by queer individuals. We can't see personal queer reflections in Tehranto if queer individuals don't go there. So on the other hand, they will not use the spaces in the neighborhood if the attitudes remain the same. So we're talking about a bit of a paradox. And this kind of chicken egg situation is something I want you to hold on to while I go talk to the village and then come back to this. So the other neighborhood that is important to look at here is the gay village. There's been a lot of recent emphasis on gay villages because of their slow disintegration and limitations. While these neighborhoods have provided safety and room for experimentation, they've also been historically discriminatory to certain groups in the LGBTQ+ community. Access has been limited or unavailable to women, bisexual individuals, non-binary, and transgender folk. They have also often fallen short of racial and class inclusions. When we look at the history of the village, the following factors contributed to its formation. First, there was a new zeitgeist in the 60s and 70s. Then we had fresh arrivals, both internally from within Canada, and also we had got a lot of draft dodgers from the US that settled in Toronto, and especially in this neighborhood. And then a number of apartment buildings in the area that you can see on this map were constructed that for the first time offered 1-bedroom and bachelor units that catered to single men, many of whom turned out to be gay. And something to recognize is that throughout its history, the gay village has never been static. So the fact that it's kind of changing now shouldn't alarm us as much as it is, though there's differences to the way that is no longer the same, and to the way it's not static. So I mapped different queer establishments in the city over time to figure out if there were patterns that resulted in the survival of the village that could help us discuss the idea of queer heritage. So I'm going to flip through them quickly. Oh, yeah, I'm just gonna, wait, here, this is the first one. You see that the establishments start to shift around. Everything was first on Young, actually, and then slowly starts to go to church. And there's a lot of patterns here that we can discuss, but I want to mainly focus on 4 patterns that resulted in the village to kind of remain the village and get formed. First, establishments constantly moved around looking for new venues. Then they shared venues to survive. Okay, then they constantly changed hands, spaces constantly changed hands between different establishments, but remained in the queer community. And then finally, collective intergenerational cultural memory was formed around spaces in the village. So these 4 patterns ensured that queering space, an act of heritage preservation, in my opinion, was done. But today, we're not able to rely on these 4 patterns to naturally occur in the village anymore because of high rents, gentrification, and zoning regulations. And besides cultural programming that is still exists in the village, all physical manifestation of the village's queer heritage is pretty much summarized in painted murals, in the AIDS Memorial, and the sculpture of Alexander Wood, who we're going to get to later. I think we should think back to the original queer heritage that the village had as a home for people who arrived in Toronto, and think of that as a place for preservation rather than keep painting murals. Not that murals are inherently bad, but it's a different way of looking at heritage. So as I kind of talk about it, the village's disappearance is not really because it's not needed. It's because of external factors like capital, zoning laws, and ultimately poor environmental design. And to ensure that it continues to be a welcoming, safe arrival space, as it's always been, the village needs to be maintained through better design and more applicable programming to the diverse needs of its users. We need to move away from viewing the spaces of the village through their origins as a semi-closeted past for white gay men, and instead focus on an inclusive queering of space today. And this idea of what it means to then design that kind of space is something that we're going to talk about. But I just want to go back a little to Tehranto, and I told you to hold on to your thoughts about it. The important thing here is to note that both Tehranto and the village do struggle with including all the diverse voices that make up the 2 communities. But I also want to note that cultural representation in space doesn't necessarily have to be tied to these 2 urban settings. So for example, both the Iranian and the queer communities put on these seasonal shows in Toronto. There's of course Pride, that queers all of downtown for a week when there's no pandemic, even though it's a big political and commercial gig, it's still, and then we can criticize that, but it's still doing queering of space. And in the Iranian community, we have Tiagan, which is a midsummer arts festival that happens every other summer, again, when there's no pandemic. And we have artists coming in from all around the world. Both events assert identity in space temporarily, but they're predictable in their reoccurrence year after year when there's no pandemic. This leads me to believe that spatial cultural heritage can be built through consistent rhythms over time, as well as through static permanence. So, okay, and in doing so, in a way, through both the built urban fabrics of the 2 neighborhoods and through the events that are held in Toronto, the Iranian queer heritage here combines both the temporary and the hidden sets of heritages we saw in Tehran and in Turkey. The permanence in Toronto is through the formation of new organizations and the home bases they create to use temporal rhythms and asserting presence in public space. And this could be as simple as Chelteke booking the ballroom at the 519 Center in the village for a Nowruz celebration, for a Persian New Year celebration. And each individual carves their own niche in this complex heritage. Iranian LGBTQ refugees in Toronto carry with them the complexities of being non-normative sexual orientations and gender identities, and then the complexities of being Iranian in the diaspora, of being or becoming immigrants and Canadians. Most living in these intersections of identities learn to highlight or downplay different aspects of their identities in different settings, and to do so is human. But the hope is that one should not feel pressured to do so out of fear. Toronto is a forever changing city with constant new immigrants arriving at its door. So permanent representation of spaces in enclave formats remain important in the city. But maybe ultimately the heritage of a diverse city like Toronto needs to prevail over the clan-based enclaves. And this is just a thought. Maybe as Toronto becomes more queer in its radical inclusion, its queer heritage will be in the mere existence of people as they wish, allowed to use public space wherever and with whatever minority group they feel desire to. All right. So the title of my thesis is Your Passport Doesn't Work Here. And kind of think about that for a second. Passports garner safe passage on account of goodwill. You expect the country you visit to respect your rights based on this small booklet that you hold in hand that invokes some greater power, authority, a queen, God, or something. If we carry passports, but we carry passports with us beyond international travel, the ability to secure any amount of safe passage, a safe existence through a coded occupation of space is what ties together the seemingly random spaces that I looked at, from cruising grounds in Tehran to social media channels on phones to apartment buildings in Ankara to the gay village in Toronto. At every step of the journey from Iran through Turkey to Canada, queer individuals must operate within different sets of codes and present different passports to gain access into different countries and communities to just simply live their lives. So if queer spaces are a reflection of queer heritage, then Iranian queer heritage is more accurately summarized in the fight to enter without the required documentation, without the required passport. And there's always a tug of war between the elements that erase and those that redraw the queer presence in this dynamic. This malleability is the only answer I've kind of really come up with when I'm talking about Iranian queer heritage in space. It seems like it's the opposite of permanency, which what heritage kind of implies, but I've learned to define heritage in more ways. And I don't think this is frankly unique to Iranian queers or Iranian queer spaces. I think this kind of malleability, you can see it across the board with queer spaces as a whole. So let me kind of circle back to the idea of this heritage. A lot of us are familiar with something like the Ontario Heritage Code, Heritage Act, that kind of observe, that kind of give us the definitions for what building is deemed as heritage or not. And we're also probably familiar with the debates around the merits of preservation versus conservation versus restoration versus renovation. And these are debates that you see in a lot of texts, especially in Riggle's Modern Cult of the Monument, its character and its origin, in which he lays out a spectrum of approaches to care as they correlate with the reasons for which objects are designated worthy of heritage preservation in the first place. And he calls these reasons values. So for example, he argues that seeking art value, which requires newness for appreciation of aesthetics, inherently opposes age value, which is a celebration of decay. And so depending on what value we seek in an object, or in our case, a building, our level of interference in its process of aging should differ accordingly. But even his kind of value system is very much preoccupied with the building's physical value and physical preservation, and neglects program or cultural role of the building when designating queer heritage. So what happens if we look at physical form and preservation only in relation to cultural heritage? And this kind of brings up James Young's argument in discussion of countercultural monuments, in which he discusses memorials in post-war Germany. He suggests that in traditional memorials, the physical object of the monument becomes a container for memory, relieving individuals of the responsibility to have to remember. And so he argues that in memorializing atrocities, the ultimate goal should not be to build something grand, but rather to remember the events ourselves. And he gives an example, the Monument Against Fascism in Harburg, which symbolizes this transfer of memory from object to the collective narrative, as individuals write on the monument and as it kind of disappears into the ground with time. And so this kind of depicting traumatic memory suggests a question: should queer heritage with its history of trauma and oppression be viewed and remembered the same way? And perhaps the heritage value of queer sites is in their inherent contestation against typical heteronormative spaces and not actually in their built forms. So with this in mind, I want to go back to Mr. Alexander Wood, because it illustrates this point so perfectly. So Alexander Wood was a magistrate in Upper Canada in the 1800s. He, in 1810, was involved in a sex scandal, and it's an interesting one because a woman gets raped and she doesn't see the face of the assailant, and she claims the only way she can identify the assailant is through the scar she left on the guy's penis as he was assaulting her. So Alexander Wood goes around asking many men to expose themselves to him so he can identify the assailant. And this becomes the sex scandal that ultimately causes this guy to get exiled back to Scotland in 1810. And this guy was kind of known as a queer person, or at least through our modern lens, we kind of view him as a queer individual. And so in the early 2000s, he became this kind of figure, cultural figure, that a lot of queer activists in Toronto started to kind of back as like a gay pioneer to aspire to. So the Business Association in Church in Wellesley Village put up this sculpture of him in 2005. They funded a lot of it themselves, and it became this monument, and it became a whole deal. People hang around it, put beads around his neck at Pride. Until last week, on June 8th, it became clear that Mr. Alexander Wood was for many years the treasury at the Society for Converting and Civilizing the Indians and Propagating the Gospel among Destitute Settlers in Upper Canada, which means he contributed greatly to organizing residential schools. So now, as of June 8th, last week, the Business Association that did a lot of legwork to put the sculpture up is now asking the city to help them take it down, because they're like, oh, this guy was supporting residential schools. So when we are talking about static heritage, and we're talking about things that are inherently non-static, even the guy's identity, like even before it came out that this guy was one of the people working for formation of residential schools, I always thought that the story around him being gay was irrelevant, because even if he wasn't sexually assaulting people by asking them to expose themselves, the whole thing was fishy. Like, we can't just be like, this guy was gay, so let's put a statue of him up. So keep this in mind when we talk about queer heritage and how we depict it. It's very much not a 1-0 situation. We need to always keep an open mind. And this brings up another ongoing project, the LGBTQ2+ National Museum in Ottawa, which is supposed to be memorializing queer heritage, and specifically talk to the LGBTQ purge that happened in the 50s into the 80s and 90s. And it will be predominantly located by the river in Ottawa. Currently, there are 5 teams that have been selected through their responses for the RFQ, and they're going to announce the winner in August this year. And I'm very curious to see what ends up happening, because I've talked to 2 firms, 2 principals who I really respect through their other work, who were part of the RFQ. One decided to pull out and not submit because the situation was too political. One decided to submit but wasn't chosen. And they think the reason they weren't chosen was because they decided not to kind of do the narrative that the government was looking for. So I would be really interested to see if we're going to end up with just like rainbow color thing on Parliament Hill, or rather not close to Parliament Hill, or like this pink washing narrative that is just to kind of, sweep things under the rug. Having said that, that doesn't mean that if you have a rainbow slapped on something, it doesn't have value. So I might be criticizing the murals in the village or talk about this thing not being this big giant rainbow as a monument. But I think there is value sometimes to having that signal, and you can make it look good. So I will raise you Claude Cormier's work in Montreal, 18 Shades of Gay on the left and the pink balls on the right. He did in the village in Montreal. And I love it. Like, this is slapping a rainbow on it, but it works. It's an urban indication of the space. It gives it presence, it gives it life, and it's a fantastic landscape project. So it's not necessarily that we don't want the rainbow slapping. It's just that the rainbow slapping should not be the only thing we want. And the rainbow slapping should look good also. It should work. Like in this case, this works. It actually does the spatial thing it's trying to do. So what does this all mean for architects? How do we architect with this? I want to take you back to the kind of key ideas I told you to hold on to. The idea that queer spaces, queer heritage is fleeting. It may not actually be about the built space, and that it doesn't need permanency. And tell you that with that in mind, we should really think about the difference between queering space, queer occupation of space, versus what queer space is, versus designing for queer individuals and communities. And I think after kind of sitting on these ideas for a little while now, I've come to conclude, and I might change my mind on this, but I've come towards kind of thinking that perhaps we can't actually design queer spaces. Like, queer spaces are the fleeting things that happen. And if you want to go back down to the theory of what queer space is, you can't design a queer space. Queer space happens. But we can design for queer individuals as architects. And I think we should, because creating for queer individuals with respect and paying attention to good design will result in good queer spaces ultimately. So I want to talk about two projects quickly. This is Crews and Tangos, which is a very famous drag bar in Toronto. And if you have been to the village, you've noticed it. So a while ago, a developer bought the lands that Crews and Tangos sits on, and there was a big uproar in the community that they were going to tear it down, they were going to kick them out. And lucky them, actually, the building is an old building. So the city doesn't really care about the fact that it's an important cultural location in the city as a drag bar. They care that the building is an old building and has heritage value in that way. Anyways, regardless, we have ended up with the proposals you see on the right, in that the condo is a U-shaped kind of donut tearing up around this thing that's getting preserved. And I absolutely love the picture on the right where they just color. I mean, we all make these diagrams in school, right? Like, you color in the thing and you call that heritage. Like, that's exactly where heritage goes. Nothing else is heritage. Like, heritage must not be preserved elsewhere. So, and I think this is exactly the point I'm trying to get to, in that I think, and I want the people who are working on this project to correct me and for this not to happen, but building a condo and just leaving that little building inside is not preserving the heritage to me, because ultimately the lease is going to run out and the price of the land is going to go so high that the Crews and Tangos people are going to get kicked out anyway. And the retail spaces they're proposing on the ground floor in red, like the kinds of programming we need to go in there for the queer village to kind of keep its heritage up is not going to be able to afford that. And you end up with like gentrification. Ultimately, you have people moving it. So to me, if this were actually going to keep the heritage alive, it would, okay, sure, keep the building and do a donut around it, but maybe offer some programmed public spaces for the 519 Center or something, or do a cooperative model of residences, do affordable housing for senior queer members of the community who are struggling right now. Do something that is not just building a donut around an old building. And finally, I want to talk to you about a project that I think does the designing for queer people beautifully. This is Friends of Ruby that I recently wrote about by Sustainable TO. And I think Paul Dowsett, the architect there, would agree with me that he didn't approach this in the respectful manner he did because the people were queer. He would do this regardless of whatever community he was approaching. So that's the point I'm trying to make. The design of this project, first I should tell you what it is. It's a transitory housing in Toronto for LGBTQ plus youth who are experiencing peculiar housing homelessness. And the way they went about this design, it's not rocket science, but it's a beautiful building that operates exactly the way it should, because they did charrettes, because they did community engagement with the community. And every decision that was made was directly from the people who were going to use these rooms. So you end up with private bathrooms, which you don't get in shelter type buildings, because in this case, they learned, people who are in these situations have been traumatized and they need their own bathrooms. You end up with a pet cleaning station, because a lot of people who live with peculiar housing situations have pets that keep them company. So yes, in this case, we do have a rainbow slapped on the facade, which is not my favorite part of the project, but it does do the signaling and the symbolism and the signage that it's doing very great, and people love it. But ultimately, I think the success of this project is in the fact that it listened to the community. And I think that's ultimately how we should approach designing for queer individuals. And I guess I kind of took you all over the place, and sorry if it was a bit all over the place, but the point I want to end on is that I don't think you can really answer a lot of these questions, and that's okay. It's okay to not know what queer heritage means when it comes to space and have multiple different questions to the question. I think in the end, what I want to leave you with is about sense of responsibility, and point out that if, as James Young puts it, the burden of remembering is what heritage is, then we should really think about what we ought to remember and what actions we take to that end, so we don't end up with another statue of Alexander Wood in the middle of our village as a symbol. Sorry if that took too long. Hi, I'm done. If you turn on your cameras, that would be really appreciated, so I don't feel like I'm sitting here alone.
Denise, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge through that very thought-provoking presentation. And now we're opening the floor to questions from anybody in the audience. So please feel free to write your questions to Paniz in the chat, or raise your hand and one of us will call on you. And I know Simone had a question, so if you want to ask that, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe while all of you are thinking about your questions, I can start one thread of conversation for you, Paniz.
Okay.
So thank you so much for speaking. I guess since you're an advocate for inclusivity and justice and design education, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how subjects relating to queering space are, they're incredibly underrepresented in the curriculum of architecture schools across Canada. I don't think in my personal experiences in undergraduate education, it was truly represented anywhere in the core curriculum, at least. And so what would be some of your greatest visions or manifestations for the representation of these subjects in the undergraduate level more than, like a thesis?
Yeah, I've talked to Anne about this. So first, I think there's some base knowledge that people should know. I think we should have some base texts that people should read about what queer space is, just baseline, introduce people to the concept. That would be great. And I think that's starting to happen a little in ICO classes at Waterloo. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the way I see it is, I think studio needs to be taught, at least not all studios should be taught the way we're being taught right now. We should have more community engaged and participatory design-based studios, in my opinion. And I think we should have studios that actually teach the students how to talk to marginalized communities and how to respectfully engage with the material and apply that in design. I think that's really where you start to understand what the issues are and how you solve for them, I guess. sometimes you can't solve it for them. And I think that's the other thing. I think the other shortcoming of architecture schools, and this is not just about queer heritage or queer space, is that you're led to believe that architecture will fix the world. Architecture will not fix the world. Like and I think, yeah, I guess moving away from an egotistical nature of the architect as the big boss who knows all the answers is the way to move forward, in my opinion. And I think that starts with the education. It starts with teaching the people that it's not about this artiste who draws a party and, I mean, sure, we'll have those people, but 99.9% of us won't be that artiste. And I personally don't want to be the artiste. Like, so, yeah, I think really teaching more participatory design studios and familiarizing people and interdisciplinary classes. I think there's a lot of insular talk that happens, not just with our school, with any kind of professional school. There's so much to learn that you end up just speaking with the same people with the same similar points of views. And I think there's incredible value, especially in undergrad, where people are young and not as exposed to the world, to have exposure to other disciplines, other faculties, and be able to learn different perspectives.
Thanks, that was a great answer. Does anyone else have questions? You can also unmute, it can be pretty casual, but if not, I'm sure like we can ask more.
I saw Evelyn Hoffman, your hand go up at the beginning. Did you have a question? No? Okay. I actually was going to ask you, Paniz, about what you thought about what constitutes a queer space, and then you kind of covered it in your presentation. So I had always thought that the community kind of creates its own space. So I was wondering what your thoughts were going to be on that, and ended up being along the same lines.
I think that's a pretty consensual, like a lot of people agree to that point. Like I think when you read the different texts on what creates queer space, a lot of people come to that point, but I guess it manifests itself differently. And I recently had a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine who's ace, and they were saying that like, yeah, all of this is great, but like none of this applies to me. I was like, yeah, this is the problem, right? We can't say queer space is one thing because there's people in the queer, like, that are inherently standing at their opposite experiences. And yeah, like, and that's what I mean when I say you can't design a queer space. Like, what is a queer space to design? The best answer I can come up with is like, oh, let's do gender neutral washrooms. And then you're like, okay, but that's just like common sense. Like, I don't know if we can call that like designing a queer space. So that's where I'm at today. Like, maybe if you ask me in a year, I'll have a different answer.
No, that's a great answer. I think given how intersectional the community is, you're on the money. Brenda?
Hi, Paniz. Great talk. I've been studying sort of care and care theory, and I have arrived to some similar conclusions that you were just talking about like, well, like, what does the architect do? And like, how do we, thinking a lot about education and such. And the one thing that sort of was tripping me up was this, in the like academic setting, you have a lot of red tape around like engaging with communities. The word for the department is eluding me.
Ethics clearance?
Yeah.
Ooh, I could write papers on it. Yeah.
And the way that I worked around that was to be doing a sort of collaborative art project. And I learned so much, and the community, just like being involved in the project, like I learned so much about the community I lived in from that was just like mind blowing, like the place that I was living in a way that I would never have, gotten otherwise. And I'm just like wondering maybe how you imagine the school sort of getting over that hurdle? Like, how do we even teach people like how to engage when we have, I mean, ethics for a really good reason, but how do we sort of I don't want to say get around, we're not getting around it. But how do we, like, what do you think about how do we do that?
It's a very good question. I've been asking myself similar questions, but there's two things I want to say. You got to do it, right? Like Anne can tell you. And how long did it take for me to get clearance? Like a year?
Yeah,
it was crazy.
The longest, and we kept it. I think we kept it a year after, just so it was well worth
we
it.
extended it. I think I can have like clearance into perpetuity. I think you still can log into the file. It's some of that is needed, and I will tell you why. Because the people, I'm glad they made me go through that, because at every step I had to question how I was approaching it, and that made me a better person. Not just a better researcher, but a better person, because I met people who had been really hurt by people who had showed up in their lives for a week, asked them very tough questions, traumatized them all over again, and then left. But that's not my relationship to the people who I talked with for my thesis, right? They're my friends. Like, we have a WhatsApp chat group. I don't know. They're not here. I told them to come. They were too busy. But like, we're... And I think part of that is needed, and whatever means that will allow for that, that's part of it. And yes, there's a lot of shortcomings into the ethics clearance process, because it was designed for like doing, I don't know, blood tests, not for talking to people about being queer refugees. But if you do it right, that's a big caveat. If you do it right, you start questioning how you're approaching the process, and you start learning from it. How do we get away? How do we do? I don't know. I know that it's done. It's done. What's that guy's name? And is it Stephen Gray at Yale? Is it at Yale? That's his name, right? Am I talking about the right guy?
I'm not sure what you're talking about now.
Oh, okay. The guy who came and did the talk at Waterloo a while ago in like 2018, and that's when me and Amina were running Children's Global Stories, and we had a conversation with him. And I think his name's Stephen Gray. Someone correct me. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And he is running studios like that at Yale, where he's going into communities, and the entire studio is being informed by what the community needs, and then they take the whole term to work on that, and they keep going back to the community and talking to it. You can't just do that tomorrow. You need to build relationships. I think a lot of times, and we've seen it, all of us have seen it, it's not done respectfully. You make promises and the work doesn't get done, or you don't fully educate yourself on the thing. And this is not just the students, profs can do this too, where you don't fully learn what the context is that you're stepping into, and you really are talking nonsense. So I guess it goes back to doing it with a sense of responsibility and respect, but I think it's doable. Like, so I'm not really answering your question, but I think it's doable if there is, I don't know, there's power behind it. If someone actually wants to put their money where their mouth is, Yeah.
Thanks, Paniz. Yeah, I think one of the things there is the time. It's an investment into that. And that's on the person teaching the studio and also educating all the students. I was just sort of like, I guess I'm thinking about it from the student perspective, because I watched once for one semester people like develop the whole thing, and like it's such a short period of time, but it's really on the person teaching to put in most of that effort, I think. But thank you.
And I think it's like, we can talk about how it might be a bigger challenge for us at Waterloo because of the co-op system and how you go back and forth every 4 months. And so if the project isn't done, like, I'm not sure how Stephen does it. I think he does it over 2 terms. So, I mean, there's solutions to all of these, right? As long as people decide to do it, you can sit down and figure it out. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Mina?
I just wanted to add a comment on that, actually, because I think, I think these things are definitely possible in the school, and I think other organizations do community engaged work all the time, and you just have to do the ethics in advance and also have a relationship, like Paniz was saying, with communities. And what the ethics doesn't cover is that kind of building relationship and trust with whoever you're doing the research with, right? Because I think the problem with ethics is often that it really separates the researcher and the kind of research participants. But sometimes you're actually like part of that community actually that you're researching, or other times, you know, there isn't that kind of, there shouldn't be that separation. Unfortunately, that's how ethics frames it often. But I do think that these things, or I hope that these things are possible within schools. And I know some schools are, I don't know of too many specific examples, but I know, for example, Sean Bailey, who's working out of the University of Manitoba, has been doing community engaged work for several years now with First Nations communities close to the like Ontario-Manitoba border. So it's possible. So anyway, I just wanted to add that comment, and thank you, Paniz, for your talk.
And Anne pointed out something great in that, yes, the instructor can do the ethics currents for the whole course. That's like, there are systems in place to get this to happen. It's just, there needs to be the will to do it. And yeah.
Okay. Anahita?
Yes, hi. So thank you, Paniz. It was really great hearing all this information. I was having a hard time grasping all of them, but it was a great job. Thank you.
Sorry, I talked too fast.
No, it was too much for me to take. And then I realized that how like I don't know nothing basically, and I have to learn a lot. So on that point, and for the educational purposes, I think it cannot be kind of achievable through one semester in one studio. It has to be like a combination of everything, like the theory courses that we have in architecture school has to be kind of crafted around learning how to deal with marginalized communities, right? And then when we do the studio, now we are ready to kind of go to the field and get our hands dirty without really needing to spend time on just getting the knowledge first, and then, you know what I mean? So it's a package in terms of education. And I also have a question for you. I'm always really, I don't know, confused how to approach something like the idea of gay village, because it's very controversial when we look at it from the point of view of other users. Like, how would they, I don't know how this will perceive for a queer person when, like, a straight person, a cisgender goes and uses their space, and how this relationship should be. And as a designer, how should we consider that? Because we are talking about integration, not separation. But there has to be a platform, a physical context for that to happen. So this is always my question, and I don't know if any of you have any answers for that, but I think we really have to discuss this a lot to see what can be done in the future.
Those are all very good points. I agree with the package thing. I think you can't do this in isolation, and it's the same with like decolonizing the curriculum, right? You can't just have like a decolonizing studio and call it a day. Anyways, so that yes, 100% there. The second question, that there's no real answer to that either, because I think at the end of the day, everything comes down to respect and showing where you come from. And this is the experience I had with this material myself. So at the time I was starting work on this thesis, I was dating a man. And so that caused a lot of trouble for me, in that people were telling me that you don't get to talk about this, blah, 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 you're not queer enough. And in many ways, no, I'm not. I have a lot of privileges as a person who dates both, actually all genders. And it's, I could live my life in Iran and be fine, and similarly, I'm not a refugee. I came here with my family. I came here, I already spoke English, and so checking in with your privilege at every step of the way and disclosing that to the people honestly and with a good heart is the first step, in my opinion. If your intentions are good and if you're not dealing with jerks, which hopefully you're not, that should be enough, you know. And listening to people who have the experiences you don't have, and respecting their opinions, and understanding that you will never be in their shoes. I did this thesis, took me 2 years, over 2 years, 2.5 years. And when did I start writing? I keep going back to, like, I was writing throughout, but like the first year, like, we didn't know what was happening. I just kept talking to people and learning, and it's overwhelming. It's so overwhelming. It's still overwhelming. After I finished, I just like went on a hiatus. Like, Tammy and I went on a road trip, and I just was like, I'm out. I don't want to do anything. and I was just like vegetating for months afterwards. So yeah, I don't know what to tell you. Go in with good intentions and show where you come from, and be ready to learn, and always be ready to be wrong. I feel like I'm preaching right now.
I think we're all enjoying it. Thank you so much, Paniz. I think the questions and the answers were all really great as well. Thank you for everyone who asked questions. Thank you for everyone who came. This is being recorded, and so I think whoever registered may get a link, or it will be posted on the University of Waterloo School of Architecture's Facebook page. But that's all the time we have for today, and hope to see you at some future events too.